right, coming at you live all the way from the lower bottoms of West Oakland. It is Bitter Lake Soundwaves. Special episode today. I have been so blessed to, was it 2 episodes ago, I spoke with Gloria La Riva, and we spoke about all kinds of leftist revolutions. And she spoke about one of the organizations that she's with did a history on China. I immediately went to the link on the Party for Peace and Liberation? Am I saying it right?
Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Party for Socialism and Liberation. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
And I saw this awesome history lesson about China starting from the late 1800s and the Opium Wars. And it was a 3-part series. And one of the people speaking on it was Professor Ken Hammond from the University of, New Mexico State University. And he is a guest on the show today. So please welcome Professor Ken Hammond.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for taking some time to talk to me today, Mr. Hammond. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
Is it Mr. Hammond or Professor Hammond? Which would you prefer?
That doesn't just call me Ken. That's fine.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, hey, if we're on that level, appreciate you, Ken. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about China. In my opinion, China is the new boogeyman for U.S. propaganda when it comes to the way we view alternative economies. The Soviet Union was the great boogeyman, and now it's China. And I even the way Trump says it is just like just gets under your skin, the China. And with coronavirus kind of first breaking out in Wuhan, or that's the first time we've seen it in Wuhan, this COVID-19, China really was made out to be the bad guy. And I just wanted to have a show where we give some context into what China really is. And it's more complex than just good or bad, right?
Absolutely.
And also recently we have all these uprisings because of, police violence is kind of a little bit of the issue. There's a lot of other issues that are reason why people are so upset and burning down buildings. But the anniversary of Tiananmen Square just happened to coincide with a lot of these riots that we've been seeing on the news. So people have been using like the images of a burnt down Target or something like that. And also that kind of iconic image of the student protester and the tank. Can you give us a little bit of context on what really was going on with was it 1989 Tiananmen Square protests?
Sure. Yeah, 1989. I mean, to understand what happens in 1989, we have to think about the period of reform, economic reform, what the Chinese call reform and opening, that had been unfolding over the previous decade. Beginning around 1979, China began to pursue a new orientation in terms of its economic development. They decided that they wanted to use what they call market mechanisms. In other words, conduct a lot of economic operations in a market context in order to accelerate the development of their productive economy, their manufacturing economy, their industrial economy, the generation of different kinds of goods and services. And that's what's still going on in China today. They still talk about being in the era of reform and opening. Obviously, it has evolved and developed a lot over that time. But in that first decade of the 1980s, they were kind of just feeling their way. This was all very new, and they were experimenting with different kinds of policies and things like agricultural reform, what they call the responsibility system, which returned a lot of direct oversight of farming operations to individual households. They also were reforming the organization of state-owned enterprises, which are really the core of the Chinese economy. And they began the process of opening up to the outside world and allowing some foreign investment in China. Well, as those policies were put in place and began to have their effects, it began to they were differential effects, shall we say, in different parts of the economy, and some people began to really prosper and flourish. And Deng Xiaoping, who was the sort of top leader at that time, very famously at one point said, to get rich is glorious. And the idea was, China wanted to become a prosperous society, a highly developed economy. He said, Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious, but, he said, some people are going to get rich before others. And that's really important to understand in the context of the reforms, because by embracing the use of markets, the Chinese accepted the idea. They acknowledged this and understood this, that would bring with it many of the things that we see with the history of market economies around the world, which is that they don't, in fact, distribute everything in a fair and equitable way, but some people get rich and some people maybe aren't getting so rich. But that would be okay for a while. This was the idea that there would be some enhancement of inequality, and that has certainly happened in China. But that would be okay for a while as a kind of price that had to be paid to develop the economy. Okay, so that's sort of the premise. And as the 80s went forward, that began to happen. The economy was growing, standards of living were increasing, the availability of all kinds of goods, especially consumer goods, was on the rise. But those effects weren't uniform, and some people in a variety of different sectors of the economy were doing very well. But there were some for whom these reforms and these changes weren't having the same kind of impact. And in particular, those were people that we might think of as sort of the educated professional class, people who were teachers or doctors or journalists or lawyers or people who their jobs just simply weren't in those parts of the economy that were expanding rapidly in this kind of new era. And they began to feel disadvantaged, a little bit left behind. And that began to express itself in their desire to have I suppose you'd say a stronger voice, make sure they had a seat at the table when policy decisions were being formulated and put in place. And so the impetus for the protests that begin in April of 1989 were students, educated youth, young professionals in Beijing and in other cities around the country, raising these demands to have their needs, their interests addressed by the leadership, by the state and the party. And as far as that went, that's certainly a reasonable set of concerns. Unfortunately, what happened was that as that movement evolved, it got manipulated in various ways, and most significantly, it got manipulated by Western media. This was a period, of course, when there was a lot of turmoil going on in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union was on the verge of starting to break up. And there was not just an expectation, but a hope, a wish, a push by Western media to portray what was happening in China, in Beijing, as one of these so-called color revolutions, something that was going to be a regime change, that sort of thing, which was not at all the intention of the protesters at the beginning. But as time went by, and especially as the occupation of Tiananmen Square took place, and Western media came to cover Gorbachev's visit there in May, the attitudes hardened on the part of the protesters, and they began to push more and more for a kind of vague and amorphous idea of Western-style democracy. You may remember they rolled out this big model of a statue like the Statue of Liberty and all that.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Within the party, there were deep divisions over how to respond to all this. There were some leaders like Zhao Ziyang who wanted to negotiate, wanted to talk, wanted to address the concerns that were being raised. But others, including Deng Xiaoping, who was sort of the main leader, saw this as a real threat to the ability of the party and the government to continue these reforms, to continue to develop the economy and enhance the lives of hundreds of millions of Chinese people. And in the end, unfortunately, what happened was that hardline, sort of confrontational leaders amongst the protesters came to dominate the protests, and more intransigent leaders within the party came to dominate the discussions within the party, and those forces were simply on a collision course. And by the night of June 3rd to June 4th, 1989, the government and party leadership decided to use the military to clear the streets and reopen the heart of the city. And it's important to remember that the heart of Beijing, the capital of the country, had been paralyzed for almost 2 months by these demonstrations. That mass transportation was disrupted, economic life in the capital was disrupted. It was a remarkable moment. But it wouldn't have been tolerated in most societies around the world. And the fact that it went on for nearly 2 months in China, I think, reflected both the deep divisions within the leadership, but also a certain level of tolerance, which in retrospect isn't all that evident, but in the moment, it was really the case. But as we all know, the military was sent in. There was a lot of fighting in the streets. We don't really know the number of people that were killed. Sources that I have, and I was in the city 10 days after this. I was in
Wow.
starting on June 14th, because I was working with an American Study Abroad program there, and we had to go back in and reopen the offices and do a lot of things. And people I spoke to at the time, I would say that probably between 600 and 800 people were killed, which is a lot of people getting killed, but it's not 10,000 or some of the figures you see bandied about. And it's important to understand that the people who were killed were both demonstrators and military personnel. There were a large number of of People's Liberation Army forces, especially on the west side of the city, along the main route there, Chang'an Street. There was a lot of fighting. There were situations where the crowds got weapons away from soldiers and turned those on the soldiers. There were instances where military vehicles were struck with firebombs and soldiers were burned. So there were casualties on both sides, and I don't want to portray it as a completely even-handed thing. Obviously, the military had the upper hand, but it was not it wasn't just the army rolled in and crushed this peaceful protest. There was a very, very violent confrontation. And eventually they reached Tiananmen Square. No one was killed in the square, and that's very well established. There were only probably fewer than 100 people still left in the square at that time. It was about 2 or 3 in the morning. They were allowed to depart, and they secured that area, and that was obviously the end of all that. But we need to look back on that. It gets portrayed, of course, in that very famous image that you mentioned of the gentleman with the shopping bags and the tank. We have that image, and it's iconic of this sort of idea of the heroic individual confronting the brutality of the state. But that guy is still around. He went on home with his groceries. And obviously, China has continued to pursue its path of reform and development, and the lives of hundreds of millions of people in China have been dramatically improved. So, the events of 1989 were tragic in many ways. Probably could have been handled better, certainly by both sides. But I hate to have that come to be the sort of image that most Americans and most Westerners have, because I think it's a distorted image of a particular moment that doesn't really represent the long sweep of recent Chinese history.
Not at all. And that's how I feel like that's how it kind of gets shown, as they're the authoritarian state. I got into a social media, I don't want to say the word debate because it really wasn't a debate. It was more of someone yelling at me because I had said something about China that wasn't negative. And they just went on and on about the Chinese Communist Party, and how authoritarian they are and all these freedoms people don't have there. And I was like, well, how many freedoms do you think you have here in the States? You think your press is that free here?
Yeah, I think that it's it's an artifact of a lot of things, but I think mostly, or one very important thing is the the limited number, shall we say, of people in the West and certainly in America who have direct experience of life in China. Very few Americans, read or speak Chinese, and I think that if you don't understand how lively and how dynamic and how open the public discourse and intellectual culture in China actually is, then you're more vulnerable to these ideas that it's this heavy-handed censorship and authoritarianism and all that, and that's just not actually the way things function. There's both on the internet, but also in print, in film, in all kinds of media. There's a very, very active civil society in China. People protest. People litigate, people write articles and organize meetings and discussions and have online forums and all this stuff. And much of that is critical of government policy, of particular leaders, and all this. Even within the Communist Party itself, there's a wide range of opinion, from people, there's people within the Communist Party today who would love to go back to the 1950s and the sort of what they think of as a kind of pure or fundamental kind of early socialism. And there's others who want to continue to throw the doors even further open to foreign investment and things like that. There's people who are deeply, deeply concerned about the environment and global warming and think that should be the top priority. And China is already doing more than any other country to address those kinds of issues. They're the biggest alternative energy people in the world. But there's just a wide range of ideas and opinions. And those are expressed and debated, and often the internet and other kinds of social media are used to hold officials responsible, to criticize and to raise issues. So this idea of it being this sort of stifled and repressed society is simply not accurate. I work a couple of times a year. I travel to China with literally with tour groups. I go as a lecturer, and I have this experience over and over and over again of Americans, and well-educated Americans who generally are pretty savvy about the world, arriving in China. We usually start in Beijing, and after the first couple of days, they're like, they're totally confused. They're like, "What's going on here? Everybody looks happy. Everybody looks healthy. They look like they're having fun. They're driving new cars. They have nice clothes. What's going on? We thought that everybody would be dressed in gray and would be sad and sort of repressed, and we just don't understand because these images that are projected in American media are so grim and they're so out of touch with reality. So that's always a kind of eye-opening experience that I rather enjoy.
Now, I've been reading David Harvey's book, A Brief History on Neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And there are he definitely talks about China and the U.S. involvement in China.
Right.
What effect has the neoliberal movement had on China? So when you spoke about there's people in the CCP that would prefer a move back to what China was doing in the 50s, does that have a lot to do with this neoliberal movement in the country?
Yeah, I think that really. I mean, I greatly admire and respect David Harvey's work, and I think that he's got his hand on or his finger on the pulse, I guess, of something really important there. I don't entirely agree with his understanding of what's happening in China, but I think that he's certainly focused on some key questions there. This idea of neoliberalism and the impact that that's having in China is really central to understanding things, because there's a perspective, and one which is in fact shared by many on the left in the West, that China has basically gone down the capitalist road. That after the Maoist period, after the Cultural Revolution, after the death of the chairman in 1976, that under Deng Xiaoping's leadership, basically they abandoned the ideals of socialism and simply embraced capitalism, and the Communist Party sort of cynically hangs on to power. But really, they've just sort of abandoned the struggle and allowed a neo bourgeoisie to take over and run things. And I don't think that that's an accurate understanding of what has happened or of what is going on today. I think that in some ways, not for David Harvey, but for bourgeois politicians, for both Democrats and Republicans, that for a long time there was an expectation that the reforms would lead to that economic reform would lead to what they think of as political reform, and that China would go through this sort of regime change process and wind up as a multi-party electoral system, much more like the ones that they already know how to manipulate here in the West. And that clearly hasn't happened, and it was really never on the agenda for the Chinese. And I think that Westerners who convinced themselves that liberal political reform was just around the corner were only deceiving themselves, only kidding themselves. I think the way to understand the situation in China is not that it has become a neoliberal playground, but rather in the terms which the Chinese themselves have used since the early 80s to talk about this. And there's a phrase. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but I think that it accurately summarizes the situation, which is using the mechanisms of the market to develop the productive economy. Okay, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier as well. That they the period from 49 to 79, China grew well over 3.5–4% every year. So they were already developing their economy, and that created a tremendous base upon which the era of reform was able to build. But China already by the late 70s had an industrial sector in its economy. Infrastructure development had gone on to a great extent in terms of railways and telecommunications and all this kind of stuff. But they wanted to improve the lives of ordinary people. Most of the development during the first 30 years was sort of, I guess we would call core development, heavy industry, agricultural cooperativization and collectivization, infrastructure development, things like that. The focus in the reform period has been much more on creating productive capacity to address consumer interests, to give people more stuff, to improve housing, to improve, to have greater variety of consumer goods, clothing, electronics, all the things that people like to have. As well as to continue to develop, to enhance the economic position of people at the lower end of the income spectrum. And I think that process has gone forward using, as they say, the mechanisms of markets, that businesses, enterprises, both state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, have been managed in ways that have been designed to maximize the improvements in productivity, in quality control, in efficiency of distribution, all these kinds of factors. And that has yielded great results. But it has also brought contradictions along with it. Inequality, China, the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest people in China, which was minimal in let's say 1980, has opened up. It's not as big as it is in the United States, but it's significant. Environmental problems, lots of, the push to develop industry has led to, pollution of the water, of the air, of the soil. And that's a real serious set of problems. And of course, it's contributed carbon production, putting that in the atmosphere, has contributed to global warming. But the Communist Party, as the sort of, I suppose you could say, almost the conscience of this process, the Communist Party has maintained all along their commitment, their avowed commitment to guiding this process, to ameliorating the worst abuses or the worst effects of markets, which, as we know, can be pretty severe and pretty harsh, in order to reach a point where China attains a level of prosperity that allows them to then pursue redistributive policies that will raise up the livelihoods of the poorest, while, in a sense, kind of reining in the excesses of the wealthiest, right? And we're in a phase now where that is going on. They're beginning that process. Actually, this year, 2020, the stated goal for this year was to achieve what they call a moderately prosperous society. Now, that's been derailed a bit by the whole COVID-19 thing. They may not hit their sort of metrics this year, but certainly within the next year or two, they're going to have achieved, they're going to have reached certain levels of achievement that they've been aiming at for a long time. So all of that is to say that instead of thinking of China, seeing China as this, as I say, as a sort of neoliberal playground, we need to see it as a complex social and political and economic environment within which the Communist Party seeks to guide this process of development, to enhance the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, recognizing that brings problems in its wake, but retaining the capability to address those problems to the degree to which that becomes possible as the economy grows and as prosperity begins to set in. So I just think that's a more balanced way of understanding the situation. They call it market socialism. They call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. There's a variety of ways to understand it. But I think that seeing it as a balancing act, as a much more nuanced and subtle process than just neoliberal capitalism run wild, I think that's much more accurate and much more useful in understanding what's happening.
So you don't I've had also debates with people where they say, well, China's just a communist, or not communist, a capitalist country.
Yeah, I don't agree with that at all.
Oversimplifying it, right?
To say the least. It's really mischaracterizing it. I mean, mm-hmm. At this point, just within the productive economy, 55% of the productive economy is still state-owned, which isn't to say it's all owned by the central government. Some of that is provincial level, county level, township level enterprises, but they're publicly, cooperatively owned. They're not private capital. And capitalism is premised upon, the extraction of surplus value for the enrichment of the owners of the means of production. Well, the owners of the means of production, the majority owners of the means of production in China, is the Chinese people via the Chinese state, or these various levels of public ownership. And the guiding force politically is the Communist Party. And one thing I think that we see these days in these last few years with the leadership of Xi Jinping is that Xi Jinping has been much more straightforward. He's been much more, not that previous leaders were deceptive about this, but Xi Jinping has been very outspoken about his commitment to Marxism and socialism and the vision of development that has been articulated within the party all along. And I think that's something that sort of freaked out political leaders and pundits in the West, that what they want is for China to sort of talk the talk, we really want to modify our political system or anything. And Xi Jinping he's just not doing that. He's not playing that game at all. And the idea that he's promoting Marxism, he had the leadership had to all do a workshop recently on rereading the Communist Manifesto. It's like he talks about, there's a phrase that Xi Jinping uses, which is the commitment to fulfill our original mission. And that's going all the way back to 1949, where the original mission was to create a just and equitable society within which the livelihoods of the people would be dramatically enhanced and secured. That's the original mission. That's what Xi Jinping is still talking about. And they see socialism and the leadership of the Communist Party as the path to achieve that. Now, is that going to work? Is that going to ultimately be successful? Who knows? I don't know. But I think that it's better to understand what the Chinese say they're doing and what their avowed aspirations are, and work on the basis of that, than to portray them as some, rising competitor, evil empire, expansionist menace. I just don't think that serves the interests either of the Chinese or certainly even of the American people.
When I was doing this show and I was telling people I was going to do the show, I asked people if they had any questions for you. Send me a question, and the very first question I had, someone said, "Are we going to go to war with China?" I was like, I don't think so. They're not the occupying empire that the U.S. is, with military bases all over the world.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think on a practical level, I think it's unlikely that we will have, any kind of hot war with China. I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. I think that there are various sort of thresholds that could be crossed that could be quite dangerous, particularly with regard to the situation in Taiwan. But I don't think that that's likely to happen. I think that cooler heads will prevail on all sides, because it isn't really in anybody's interest for there to be any kind of serious military conflict between the United States and China. I do think that the United States has adopted a much more aggressive attitude towards China. There's just on May 20th, the White House released a new policy document, a strategic approach to the People's Republic, that reads like a kind of mirror reflection of American conduct, accusing the Chinese of all the things that the United States has done internationally. But as you just noted, China does not have hundreds of bases around the world, including encircling China itself. They certainly don't have military bases encircling the United States. They don't take over and dominate other people's countries. They don't have certainly a history of doing that. It's China's international engagements are primarily aimed at enhancing trade and transportation, which of course is in their own interest because that'll help them continue to develop their own economy. But it's also beneficial to the host countries that are getting infrastructure and investment, and that's not being done on a free handout kind of basis, but it's also not being done on the kind of massive extraction of wealth that formed the foundation of Western imperialism for a couple of centuries. It's a much more collaborative and interactive kind of approach. So I think that the threat of war is a real one. I work with an organization called Pivot to Peace, which is supposed to counteract the pivot to Asia that the American military announced and has been pursuing. And I think it's important to work to build consciousness about this and to encourage people to be aware of the threats that America's attitude towards China raises. But I don't really anticipate that warfare is likely to break out, certainly in the foreseeable future.
And it feels like the U.S. is almost embarrassed by how far China has come along, especially with their response to coronavirus or COVID-19, as far as building hospitals. And when was it 6 days?
Yeah, I mean, obviously these past few months and the experience with the COVID-19 crises has been. It's been quite an arena of ideological conflict, shall we say? I mean, the Chinese, these cases began to appear. It took them a little while to figure out. I mean, they didn't have absolutely immediate 2020 clarity because these were brand new things. It took them a few days to figure out what was going on. But as they did that, they shared information. They put the genome out there. They put all kinds of information out to the WHO and into the global community quickly. And they responded very effectively to the outbreak. Indeed, their response was criticized so much by the West. In terms like draconian, were applied. But what we see is that it was in fact efficient and effective. A country of 1.4 billion people had fewer than 5,000 deaths, whereas the United States, which dragged its feet, has been chaotic to say the least in its response, and which treats public health as a profit-generating commodity rather than a public good. We've had 110,000 deaths now in a population of 320 million. So clearly, I think any kind of impartial regard of these experiences would suggest that the Chinese model of public health as a human right rather than as something that can enrich corporations, certainly allowed them to respond much more effectively to a massive challenge than the Western countries. Even the social democracies of Europe have not coped with this anywhere near as well as has China. And it's not just China. Vietnam, South Korea, Asian countries that have traditions of more communal cooperation have been much more effective in general. But certainly China's socialist system and its ability to direct resources through its central mechanisms, was able to put this thing down and save, obviously, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives in ways that America and the West in general simply hasn't been able to match.
And to that point, for the building of the hospitals and the way that China invests in public health, it seems like the response in a lot of the communist countries is to invest a good amount of money into public health. And it's like we're seeing the flaws of this system in real time in the U.S.
Yes, it's not to get too grandiose about it, but one of the areas that politicians and pundits like to contrast between the U.S. and China, between the Western world and the socialist countries, is this whole rhetoric, this whole discourse of human rights. And the current moment, of course, is fraught with irony about that in a number of ways. The Chinese conception of human rights is things like food and housing and healthcare and a job and some human decency, whereas the American rhetorical position is that, when they talk about human rights, it's these sort of abstract values of things like free speech and free press and all that. But in the context of the current political situation in the United States, we see that the rhetoric of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly is not honored, because we have the President of the United States calling for military intervention to prevent protesters from peaceably assembling in the nation's capital. And we have that same president lashing out against the press in ways that suggest that there are, in fact, political standards that have to be met. And we know that just in general that there's a very narrow band of acceptable political expression beyond which critical voices simply fall silent, not entirely silenced or censored, but marginalized so effectively by the massive power of corporate journalism and media that this idea of even the rhetorical commitment to Western style human rights falls by the wayside when the going gets tough. Whereas, as I say, on the Chinese side, they have their positions on human rights, and they are about the fundamental needs of the masses of the Chinese people. And we've seen that they're prepared to effect those, to put those into practice in a moment of crisis in a way that lives up to their own rhetoric. So I think the contrast has been remarkable.
And to that point about America and free speech, we have a president that's literally upset about freedom of speech and social media, trying to pass laws about what social media can and cannot say. And B, I have not been allowed to promote my post of my conversation with Gloria La Riva on Facebook. They've denied me 3 different times. They've rejected my ad to promote that post.
Huh.
So there you go. There's your freedoms right there.
Well, and Gloria La Riva, of course, is a legitimate candidate for president who's going to be on the ballot in many states come November. So the idea that she doesn't have the right to be heard on American social media, that raises an interesting dimension of things, which is that censorship in the United States is not something that's only a matter of what the government does. It's also a matter of what corporations do, and the control of discourse here and the control of information here, is largely in the hands of private interests, of corporate interests. There's a lot of criticism again raised of China about issues of, it's often called a surveillance state because the government does indeed access a lot of information and use a lot of information about the people in order to address the needs of the people, the interests of the people, to tailor programs to what people want and need. But the fact that in China that's done often using mechanisms of the state is portrayed in this sort of Orwellian 1984 nightmare vision. Whereas in the United States, I think arguably the amount of data, the amount of information that private corporations accumulate and commodify and circulate about the American people is vastly greater. And we are manipulated and coerced in ways in the market and through the information that is accumulated about us by businesses, to an extent that's probably much greater than anything that we see going on in China. But because that's done by private businesses, by private capital, it's supposed to be perfectly fine and okay. And I think again, this is the theme we've touched on over and over, that the contrasts between the rhetoric of America and the realities of practice here, and what goes on in China, the contradiction or the contrast there is pretty visible and pretty strong.
Very strong. So, and one last thing I kind of want to touch on. I know you're a busy man. The Belton Road Initiative.
Yeah. Well, what about it? I mean, the Belton Road.
Belton Road. I feel like I feel like the little bit. First of all, you don't hear about it too much on U.S. media.
Right. I think that when you do hear about it, when you hear about China's international activities in general, in American media, in Western media, they're generally portrayed as some sort of neo-colonialism, that China's out to exploit other countries, especially poor and developing countries, and as if that's a cynical and oppressive relationship on the part of China. And again, I think that's this sort of mirroring of our own historical practice, that certainly the era of Western imperialism, Western colonialism, including American colonialism in the Philippines, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and other places, the overthrow of the independent kingdom of Hawaii, things like that. We have our own history in that regard, as well as, not to mention, the dispossession of indigenous peoples across North America. But,
exactly.
So it's sort of ironic when the United States takes an attitude or a posture of criticism on that. But I also think that it's simply inaccurate, that the Belton Road Initiative is a largely an infrastructure initiative to build railways across Central Asia to connect Pacific markets with the Mediterranean and the Atlantic world. It's building port facilities in Southeast Asia or Pakistan or Africa or Latin America to enhance the ability of those countries to engage with the global economy. It's investment in infrastructure in countries. There's a long history of Chinese investment in Africa, not just the current period, but going all the way back to the 50s and the 60s, that has helped countries like Tanzania and Zambia and West African countries to develop their economies in ways that the extractive relationships with European or American capital just simply never did. Um, and it's not just building ports and railways. It's building hospitals and schools and government offices and things like that. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, that it's not a giveaway. It's not a pro bono project that the Chinese are doing. China is still, despite all the progress it has made, there's still a lot of poor people in China on a per capita basis. China's productivity is still only about a fifth of that of the United States. The wealth produced in the country, there's still a lot to be done in China. They're not in a position to just be giving away everything to the rest of the world. But I think that the agreements, the loans, the investments that are made by China in other countries are not out of line with certainly with what might be called international standards, and often are much more favorable than the kind of standard loan packages that countries get from the IMF or something like that. Plus, China doesn't impose conditions on the investments and the loans that it makes in terms of the domestic political operations of the host countries. The IMF or the World Bank, they routinely intervene in welfare policies. They're the biggest architects of austerity policies in countries around the world as qualifying requirements to get the sorts of loans that the IMF and the World Bank make. The Chinese don't impose those kinds of conditions. Now, that's, again, in the Western media, that's often portrayed as, oh, they're just, pandering to autocrats and things like that. And, you can have those criticisms, but the reality is that China has always premised its international relations on what they call non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign countries. And they wish that the West would treat China that way, but that's another set of issues. So I think the Belton Road, again, needs to be understood not as like a Chinese welfare program, but as a clear-eyed campaign to develop global infrastructure, especially in developing countries, in ways which will be mutually beneficial to both China and to those host countries. And not to the host countries in a kind of spoken wheel way where it's, one country relating to China, but creating networks and interconnections between those developing countries, which will allow them to further enhance their economies in relation to one another. So I just think that maybe one reason it doesn't get talked about as much in the West is that it's actually both it's working and it's beneficial, and maybe it's not actually such a bad thing, and portraying it in these negative critical lights maybe gets harder and harder as it develops, as it grows, as it is successful.
It seems to be the antithesis of the austerity-driven IMF policies that have crippled African nations for decades.
Yeah. I mean, you hear this idea of China's neocolonialism in Africa, and it just doesn't stand up to any kind of substantive analysis.
My goodness, Mr. Hammond, thank you so much. Ken, thank you so much for spending some time to talk with me today about a few questions we have about China and the way we look at China from the U.S. capitalist media lens. Real quick, do you want to plug anything that you're doing outside of teaching?
Well, I mentioned that I've been working with Pivot to Peace, and I think that's an important organization. It's a national organization. We have people all over the country and a lot of very prominent endorsers. We have a website, if I can mention that, which is
of course
the website is Peace Pivot, all one word, peacepivot.org. And of course, we're on Facebook and things like that. So if people want to take a look at the mission statement for that and some of the people who've endorsed us for that, people like Oliver Stone and Maxine Hong Kingston, and just a lot of very interesting people. I'm doing a lot of work with them these days. I think that the upcoming election is important stuff to be engaged with. Support Gloria La Riva, and that would be good. I know she's going to be on the ballot there in California. Just keep everybody should keep an open mind, stay critical, keep reading, keep thinking, just keep the struggle going.
Again, Ken, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put a link in the description of the show to the Pivot to Peace website, as well as a link to your YouTube videos on the China classes.
Very good. Thank you.
Which I really, 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 really dug, man. Guys, please click those links for those China classes. It gives you great context and perspective on the history of China. You started around the Opium Wars, right?
Yes. We started at the beginning of the 19th century, which is really when, because of the Industrial Revolution, the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world starts to change. And the Opium Wars in China are probably the starkest example of that, the use of British military force to compel China to open its doors to drug dealers. It's kind of a remarkable experience, and it's a good place to start.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Ken, don't hang up. I'm going to play some music and we're out. Don't hang up, Ken.